Hi, and thank you for a great question. It looks like you are at the end of the chapter when you're getting into questions like these, so great job with your studying. So with this type of question, we are given the mass of our aluminum sulfate sample of 7.20 grams, and we're looking for the mass of oxygen, oxygen being a constituent element. And all that means is that it's just one of the elements in the compound. So if you have 7.2 grams of aluminum sulfate, how much of that is oxygen? So we're looking for a part of the 7.20 grams to be oxygen. When we're doing this type of question, it's great to map out the conversions that we're going to be doing. We're starting out with the mass of our aluminum sulfate, and from there we want to go to moles of aluminum sulfate. We're going to convert our mass of aluminum sulfate to moles of aluminum sulfate, so we're going to need to know the molar mass of that. And then from there we can do a conversion to moles of oxygen. That's the big one, because once we have our moles of oxygen, we can then go to grams of oxygen. So in order to go from mass of aluminum sulfate to the mass of our constituent element of oxygen, we're looking at 1, 2, 3 conversion factors that we have to multiply our sample by. So a couple of things that we need to know in order to do this. In order to go from grams of aluminum sulfate to moles of aluminum sulfate, we are going to need to know the molar mass of aluminum sulfate, and we can do that by adding up the mass of each of the constituent elements inside of it. We also need to know the moles of oxygen in 1 mole of aluminum sulfate, and we can do that right now. It's just going to be 4 oxygens. We have 4 oxygens here times this 3 gives us altogether 12 oxygen in aluminum sulfate, which is also means that there are 12 moles of oxygen. So for every mole of aluminum sulfate, there are 12 moles of oxygen. And that's going to help us out when we get to this conversion here, and then molar mass of oxygen, which we get from the periodic table, which is 16 grams of oxygen for every mole of oxygen. That's going to help us with the final conversion. So before we do that, I have to find out my molar mass, and that's going to be 2 times the mass of aluminum, which is 26.98, plus we have 3 sulfurs, so 3 times 32.06, and then 3 times 4 is 12 oxygen, so 12 times 16.00 grams of oxygen. And then I've already done my calculations for these, so I'm just going to put them in here so you can check when you're doing yours. And so the final total for my molar mass is 342.14 grams per mole of aluminum sulfate. Okay. Now that I have that, I can now go and do my conversion. I always start with what I'm given, which is my grams of aluminum sulfate, which was 7.20. Of aluminum sulfate. Then I have to convert to moles of aluminum sulfate. So I want to go to moles, and I know 1 mole of aluminum sulfate is 342.14 grams. I put grams on the bottom because I want to convert from grams to moles, and this is the way that I cancel out my grams, by putting it on the bottom, and now I have moles. So I've done this now. That was my first conversion. Now I'm on to moles of oxygen. So I have, for that one, I'm going to put this. I know I have 12 moles of oxygen to 1 mole of aluminum to sulfate. So that was back up here when I was looking at 1 mole of aluminum sulfate has 12 moles of oxygen. So 1 mole of aluminum sulfate here is going to cancel out with 1 mole of aluminum sulfate there. So I've gone from moles of aluminum sulfate to moles of oxygen. That's done now. So 12 to 1 is that ratio, which we figured out here. Lastly, I'm going from moles of oxygen to grams of oxygen, and I know that I have 16.00 grams of oxygen in 1 mole of oxygen. Moles of oxygen cancel out. That leaves me with my grams of oxygen, which I will calculate by multiplying my top, then multiplying my bottom, and then dividing. So when I go across, I get 7.2 times 1 times 12 times 16 gives me 1,382.4, and that's all over 342.14 times 1 times 1, so that's 342.14. And then when I divide these, my final answer is 4.04 grams of oxygen. And I always like to go back and look and see if that makes sense. This should be a smaller mass than the total mass of the sample, and that is true. So 4.04 grams of oxygen are in a 7.20 gram sample of aluminum sulfate. So I hope this helps to piece it together. Definitely remember this solution path when you're doing questions like this. Thanks for asking. Keep those questions coming. Bye for now.